Early European explorers in Texas. All right. We have set up the first peoples of Texas, which we often call Indians, and we have seen how they lived in a variety of different areas in a variety of different circumstances. Texas Indians were never the rich Indians of North America. They were always the poor Indians of North America. Probably the richest of the Texas Indians were the Wichitas, uh, which in East Texas, because they had the greatest amount of resources. But now that we set that up for you, of course, we also mentioned the Spanish are eager to explore the new lands they discovered. Of course, they were looking for a water route to Asia so they could find wonderful silks and wonderful spices that they had discovered during the Crusades. But as they sailed west to get to the east, they ran across the Americas, unknown land that would eventually make Spain one of the wealthiest countries on earth for probably 150 years. But as the Spanish arrive, of course, they start to explore the area. And as we saw, they certainly explored central Mexico and found the Aztec Empire, which eventually they conquered, and South America and the Inca Empire, which they explored and conquered. And both those empires were quite wealthy. And so, as we'll see, many times Spanish conquistadors, Spanish explorers in Texas were looking for those type of civilizations. They were looking to get rich off gold that they believed existed in the vicinity. And again, why wouldn't they? Since obviously there was much gold and wealth in central Mexico and much gold and wealth in South America as well. So one of the as Cortez was fighting to capture the Aztec Empire in 1519 in central Mexico. Another Spaniard, Pineda, became the first European to explore and map the coast of what we now call Texas. So Pineda was actually looking for some type of a link between Florida and what we now know as Mexico. The Spanish had already, from their bases in Hispaniola and later from Cuba, had explored Florida. They had, of course, arrived in what we now know as Mexico. And so the Spanish were trying to see if there was a water route between the two, between, for example, Florida and Mexico, that might lead the way to China, water route all the way to China. So Pineda was exploring this area, and he set off in Florida and rounded the coast. And as he was looking for a water route to Asia, he did notice a very large river opening to him that might be the water route to Asia. But he sailed on, and of course that was the Mississippi River, and he sailed on and mapped the coast of what we now know as Texas, and eventually came back to what we now know as Mexico. There he had sort of a falling out with Cortez. We do have the maps of Pineda. We don't really have any of his diary entries or writings, so we don't know exactly what he thought about the coast of Texas. Probably not too excited about it because, again, he was looking for that sort of a water route to Asia still. So other Spanish explorers also looking for cities of gold. One of the first ones we look at is Cabeza de Vaca's route. And de Vaca, again, looking at Spanish Florida, or looking at Florida for some type of wealth. His expedition did not go well, unfortunately for him. He was part of a larger expedition, and when the Spanish arrived in Florida, many bad things happened to them. So a Spanish force of 400 sent to explore Florida in 1527 failed. They had several ships that were wrecked. There was bad weather. The Indians were not friendly. And so the Spanish decided to try to build a few small ships, a few rafts, and tried to sail back to Cuba. But as they left the Florida coast, apparently they ran into a hurricane, and it pushed them actually westward, so far west, they ended up near Galveston Island in 1528. About 80 people actually survived out of the 400, and one of those survivors was Cavazza de Vaca. De Vaca and other survivors became slaves to several different groups of Indians. So the Indians, the Chronicles especially, did not welcome strangers, and oftentimes would enslave those that arrived on their territory without their permission. Now, de Vaca became sort of a trader and a healer in the Indian society he was in, but he was still considered a slave. He was still considered property when he did not heal the Indians like the Indians thought they should be healed. He was often denied food. He was beaten, among other bad things that happened to him and the other survivors. During this time, the 80 original survivors dwindled down to about 4 people. And after living several years among the Indians, de Vaca and the last 3 survivors decide to try to escape and make their way back to the Spanish settlements in Mexico. One of the survivors that did actually survive from Florida and the original shipwreck near Galveston and the slavery in Texas with the Indians, Esteban, as he was often called, had been a slave that the Spanish had acquired from Africa. And of course, you might think about poor Esteban. He was considered a slave to the Spanish, and then he, of course, was shipwrecked near Galveston. He met the Indians, and the first thing they did was to enslave him as well. So poor Esteban, almost like double slavery. He was enslaved by the Spanish, who were captured by the Indians. So unfortunately, he didn't stand much of a chance, although he did survive. Together, the 4 men traveled 2,400 miles and made it back to Mexico City in 1536. Now, eventually, the Spanish ran into some friendly Indians that helped them come back to Mexico, but it was a very long walk, so to speak. As you can see by the map, along the way, they went through parts of Texas and crossed the Rio Grande River a couple of times before making it back on the western coast of Mexico and eventually walking all the way to Mexico City. So that was certainly a tale of survival, but one thing they did not see in Texas was cities of gold. They did not find great riches in Texas. They basically found some very hostile Indians that were not very rich Indians, but nevertheless the Indians were happy to enslave them. And so you can, of course, imagine the report that de Vaca reported back to the Spanish. He reported back that although Texas might have some agricultural potential, that there were some drawbacks to this area. Next expedition looking for cities of gold was a man named Coronado, who would leave Mexico looking for wealth in North America. Since the Spanish had found wealth in Central America and found wealth in South America, why not find wealth in North America? In 1540, Coronado led an expedition of 1,000 men and 1,500 horses and set off to look for rumored cities of gold. He arrived in modern-day Arizona and New Mexico and found that an agricultural society of pueblos, basically those mud brick buildings. And the Spanish stayed for several months. Unfortunately, the Indians did not appreciate them staying. The Indians did not have room for guests, especially the large number of guests that the Spanish brought. They did not have food for the large number of Spanish who arrived. And the Spanish oftentimes confiscated the Spanish food, confiscated the Indian food and took the Indian dwellings over for themselves. So eventually, one of the Indians came forward and said that he knew of a large Indian civilization that was very rich, Quivira, and that lay to the east. And so the Spanish said, wow, this must be like another Aztec or Inca empire. Let's go check it out. And off Coronado left, leaving the nice Pueblo Indians finally to themselves, and the Pueblo Indians rejoiced that the Spanish had left on their voyage to go look for the nice Golden City. In 1541, the Coronado expedition reached Palo Duro Canyon in Texas. They were not doing very well. They had lost many of their horses. The men have run out of food. It looked like they might be starving to death. But then some friendly Indians, which the Spanish named the Tejas Indians, assisted the Spanish and found food for the Spanish. The Spanish found some water, and the Spanish were saved. The Spanish actually celebrated what they call a Mass of Thanksgiving, a religious service of Thanksgiving in Texas in 1541 at Palo Duro Canyon. The Indians were not invited. Apparently they just watched as the Spanish celebrated a religious service and celebrated eating all they could. And of course, who can blame them since they almost starved to death? But having said that, the Indian that was guiding them now led them north into what we now know as Kansas. There, the Spanish did find Quivira, but it was not exactly a rich Indian civilization. There were some grass huts, a few farms, and many bison or buffalo. The Spanish did not appreciate being lied to and executed their Indian guide. But the Spanish did claim the land for Spain. Coronado and his men then returned to Mexico. They too reported that Texas soil was good for farming, but no gold or silver. The Spanish would also settle for that, but sadly for them, there was no silver in Texas either, at least none they could find. So again, a very long expedition over a couple of years. And again, this helped explore Texas. The de Vaca expedition had moved into eastern and southern Texas. The Coronado expedition, of course, was sort of centered in northern Texas and the North Texas Panhandle, as we would call it today. But nevertheless, no gold, just some good farmland, perhaps. In 1581, the first Spanish explorer reached the area where we know El Paso today. And because the Rio Grande there flows through two mountain ranges, it was called El Paso del Norte, the Northern Pass. The Spanish were pleased that there was a way through the mountain, and again, a nice, easier way to travel, perhaps to find those golden cities they were always looking for. In 1598, Juan Ollanta led a huge expedition of 600 people to start settlements on the upper Rio Grande River. So by this time, the Spanish realized the land might be good for farming, and so the governor of what we now know as Mexico had given Ollanta large land holdings in the area, and so he led a large expedition of people to start settlements in that area. He marched his party through the area, but bad news. For 50 days, it was rainy and stormy, and shortly thereafter, the rains left and the hot desert heat came. So by the time the Spaniards actually got near the Rio Grande River, they had run out of food. They had not had any water for a week, and they were on the verge of death. But again, some nice Indians, the Tejas Indians, basically came and rescued them and showed them where they were. They brought them into what we know, the town of El Paso today. The Spanish and the Indians then combined. The Spanish went off and shot some game animals in the forest. The Indians fished. They brought their meals together. The Spanish again celebrated a mass of Thanksgiving. They also put on the first drama production that we know of in the New World and in what we now know as the United States. And otherwise celebrated a day of Thanksgiving. So the Pilgrims' Thanksgiving in 1621 gets a lot of credit, but that's often sort of a misinterpretation because we forget that in the modern day United States, the Spanish had been in what we now consider the United States for over 100 years before the English ever arrived. So the Spanish had celebrated several feast and Thanksgiving days before the official one that we would come to know with the Pilgrims. So the Spanish settled in the area and eventually, of course, through those mountain passes, would eventually reach what we now know as New Mexico and start the city of Santa Fe in 1609. So far it's been all about the Spanish. And the Spanish have been looking for cities of gold. They've been looking for wealth. So most Spanish were not too well pleased to find out there was not gold in what we now know as Texas. Most of those expeditions suffered heavy losses. Many of the people that went on those expeditions into Texas and into what we now know as the southwestern portion of the United States never came back. And so the Spanish were not exactly excited, perhaps not as excited as we are about living in Texas, but nevertheless they claimed the land for themselves, and eventually they would use that as a borderland, as a buffer zone between the rich area in what we now know as Mexico and South America and the English and French and other areas that were in North America. So eventually Texas did have its use for the Spanish, but even though we Texans like to brag a lot about Texas, the Spanish were not bragging for us in the 1600s when they walked across the area. Now, besides the Spanish, eventually another group would settle in early colonial Texas, the French, led by a French explorer, a guy named La Salle. La Salle had been looking for that water route to Asia, still looking for that water route to Asia, still trying to find the rich stuff. He had arrived in what we now know as Canada and sailed up the St. Lawrence River, saw the Great Lakes, and then saw this apparently a mighty body of water heading south, and he basically, he and his party took several canoes down the river, hoping the river would turn into what we now know as the Pacific Ocean. But of course, the Mississippi River, did not lead to the Pacific Ocean. It led to the Gulf of Mexico, which leads back to the Atlantic Ocean, which leads back to France, where he came. So the trip down the Mississippi River was quite an adventure. But once he realized he was at the mouth of that it was not the Pacific Ocean, he decided to return, and then La Salle decided to take some ships and try to look for the mouth of the river by ship. He had come down the river, and now his idea was to sail into the Gulf of Mexico and find out where that river had been. He missed the mouth of the Mississippi River by about 400 miles, landing in what is today Corpus Christi, Texas. So you can see there by the map, the red areas. La Salle had traveled down from the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi River. 4 years later, he returns in the Gulf of Mexico looking for the Mississippi River. And again, as you can see by the red arrows, he misses it by quite a bit. Sorry about him. When he arrives, he and his 200 colonists build a settlement near what we now know as Corpus Christi, near Matagorda Bay, called Fort St. Louis. Perhaps, of course, the Fort St. Louis is was named after his time, it does not do justice to what he actually built, which basically was sort of a log barricade, but later people renamed it a fort, which sort of grants it a greater status than it actually had at the time. But nevertheless, he built a settlement in the area. Then he started exploring the area, hoping to find the Mississippi River. Of course, he had quite a ways to go until he found the Mississippi River. But nevertheless, over several years, he ventured further and further from this area, and eventually, in an expedition in 1687, he was looking for the Mississippi River, still nowhere close to it. When some of his men became upset that they were still looking for this river instead of going back to France, they killed him. Eventually, the group of people he was with sort of split up, and 6 of the men eventually made it back to Canada and back to France. But La Salle was killed here in Texas. Meanwhile, back at the fort, back at the settlement, and the settlement did have some cannons, but unfortunately the cannons had no cannonballs nor gunpowder to fire them. But they had salvaged them from one of their ships that had wrecked, and I guess they looked impressive in the sort of the mud log dwellings they were living in, but nevertheless provided no real defense. So over time, the 200 settlers had dwindled because of disease, because they went off looking for food and they never came back, probably killed by Indians. But eventually, by 1688, there were only about 20 people in the settlement of Fort St. Louis. And then near Christmas time of 1688, the Karankawas attacked the fort, or well, the settlement as it was. The Indians killed all the adults and took 4 of the children they had not killed as captive. About 4 months later, a Spanish force arrived overland. The Spanish had actually been trying to find the French colony for 4 years. So the Spanish had learned that a French colony was in Texas from some Indians who passed along to other Indians who passed along to the Spanish, but they weren't quite sure of the location. What the Spanish were sure of was this was Spanish land, and they certainly weren't going to allow any French people to live on Spanish land. And so they had been looking for 4 years to find the settlement so they could basically arrest these French people and take them back in chains, or perhaps sell them as slaves, or perhaps even kill them. But when the Spanish finally arrived, they find the settlement has been wiped out by the Indians. They do eventually, after several more expeditions, recapture the 4 children and take them back to Europe eventually. And it's from one of those children that we sort of learn the story about what happened at the fort, at the Indian attack, and how the Indians had taken the children. One of the children was 10 years old at the time, so he was able to relate his story and the story of what happened at the summit to the Spanish. Of course, the Spanish were quite pleased that the fort had been wiped out. After all, this was their land. Well, if you don't count the Indians being there that thought it was their land. But the Spanish had certainly claimed it for the King of Spain, and they believed it was their land. Of course, the Indians, as we'll see, certainly believed otherwise. The Indian groups in Texas still believed it was their land, and that will, of course, lead to some conflict in the future. So the most direct result of the French exploration of Texas was that the Spanish interest shifted from western Texas to eastern Texas. That is, the Spanish eventually realized there was no golden cities here in Texas, but they thought there might be some other economic opportunities, and they certainly didn't want the French to have those economic activities that were obviously Spanish opportunities. And so to keep the French out, the Spanish started thinking about creating settlements in what we now know as East Texas. The Mississippi River and that area had been claimed by France, and that was a little bit too close to the Spanish area for the Spanish mind, and therefore they start thinking about creating settlements in what we now know as East Texas, basically just to keep the French out. And again, the gold and silver, Central Mexico and in South America, nothing here. So Texas sort of becomes like a big wall to keep other nations out of the Spanish silver and gold mines further south. But after many years of disinterest, the Spanish now resume exploring the Gulf Coast and settling in the Texas area of what they call New Spain.